everybody. Happy first week of summer. I hope you all, for those of you that were in school, I hope you had a good last week of school online and that you were able to say goodbye to your teachers, even though it might have been a little bit weirder than most years, but I hope it was good anyways. This week is our last week of Fruit of the Spirit. Over the last 8 weeks, we've talked about a lot of different fruits of the Spirit. So let's try and name them together. We've talked about love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and I think that's it. I might be missing one. And this week we are talking about self-control. So what self-control means is doing what we think God wants us to do and not necessarily what we want to do. Self-control is also saying yes to things that are good for you and no to things that are not good for you. So for example, maybe your friends at school are talking about somebody behind their back and you are in that group. And you say, no, I don't want to talk about this because you know it's not nice and you know that it's not good. And that is what self-control is saying no to things that you know are not good for other people, for yourself, and saying no to things that you know God wouldn't want you to do. And saying yes to things that you know God would want you to do, like walking away from a situation like that. So our verse comes from 2 Timothy chapter 1. Verse 7, and 2 Timothy is in the New Testament near the back of the Bible, like a lot of our verses have been. And there's 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, and our verse, like I said, comes from 2 Timothy. Chapter 1, verse 7, for the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-control. So the word timid in there means kind of nervous or a little bit quieter, but in this case it kind of means nervous. So for the Spirit God gave us, it does not make us timid, so nervous, but gives us power, love, and self-control. God gives us self-control. So I'm going to be reading you a story from the book of Genesis today. And Genesis is at the beginning of the Bible, and this story is about two people who you might have heard of before. Their names are Adam and Eve, and they were the first two people that God created. And you'll see in this story that one of the characters did not have self-control, and we will talk about that after I read the story. So this story is called The Terrible Lie, and it comes from Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve lived happily together in their beautiful new home, and everything was perfect for a while, until the day when everything went wrong. God had a terrible enemy. His name was Satan. Satan had once been the most beautiful angel, but he didn't want to be just an angel. He wanted to be God. He grew proud and evil and full of hate, and God had to send him out of heaven. Satan was seething with anger and looking for a way to hurt God. He wanted to stop God's plan, stop this love story right there. So he disguised himself as a snake and waited in the garden. Now, God had given Adam and Eve only one rule. Don't eat the fruit on that tree, God told them, because if you do, you'll think you know everything. You'll stop trusting me, and then death and sadness and tears will come. You see, God knew if they ate the fruit, they would think they didn't need him, and they would try to make themselves happy without him. But God knew there was no such thing as happiness without him, and life without him wouldn't be life at all. As soon as the snake saw his chance, he slithered silently up to Eve. Does God really love you? The serpent whispered. If he does, why won't he let you eat the nice, juicy, delicious fruit? Poor you. Perhaps God doesn't want you to be happy." The snake's words hissed into her ears and sunk down deep into her heart, like poison. Does God love me? Eve wondered. Suddenly, she didn't know anymore. "Just trust me," the serpent whispered. "You don't need God. One small taste, that's all, and you'll be happier than you could ever dream." Do you think Eve is going to show self-control here? Do you think she's going to do what God wants her to do, or do you think she's going to do what she wants to do? Do you think she'll eat the fruit or not? Maybe you've heard this story before and you know the answer. Eve picked the fruit and ate some, and Adam ate some too. And a terrible lie came into the world. It would never leave. It would live on in every human heart, whispering to every one of God's children, "God doesn't love me." And it wasn't a dream. It was a nightmare. A dove flew from Adam's hand. A deer darted in a thicket. It was as if they were frightened by something. A chill was in the air. Something strange was happening. They had always been naked, but now they felt naked and wrong, and they didn't want anyone to see them, so they hid. Later that evening, as God was taking his walk, he called to them, "Children?" Usually Adam and Eve loved to hear God's voice and would run to him, but this time they ran away from him and hid in the shadows. "Where are you?" God called. "Hiding," Adam said. "We're afraid of you." "Did you eat the fruit I told you not to eat?" God asked them. Adam said, "Eve made me do it." "What have you done?" God asked. Eve said, "The serpent made me do it." And terrible pain came into God's heart. His children hadn't just broken the one rule. They had broken God's heart. They had broken their wonderful relationship with him, and now he knew everything else would break. God's creation would start to unravel and come undone and go wrong. You see, sin had come into God's perfect world because of Adam and Eve's actions, and it would never leave. God's children would always be running away from him and hiding in the dark. Their hearts would break now and never work properly again. God couldn't let his children live forever, not in such pain, not without him. There was only one way to protect them. "You will need to leave the garden now," God told his children, his eyes filling with tears. "This is no longer your true home. It's not the place for you anymore." But before they left the garden, God made clothes for his children to cover them. He gently clothed them, and then he sent them away on a long, long journey out of the garden, out of their home. Well, in another story, it would all be over, and that would have been the end. But not in this story. God loved his children too much to let the story end there. Even though he knew he would suffer, God had a plan, a magnificent dream. One day, he would get his children back. One day, he would make the world their perfect home again. And one day, he would wipe away every tear from their eyes. You see, no matter what, in spite of everything, God would love his children with a never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. And though they would forget him and run from him, deep in their hearts, God's children would miss him always and long for him. Lost children yearning for their home. Before they left the garden, God whispered a promise to Adam and Eve. "It will not always be so. I will come to rescue you, and when I do, I'm going to battle against the snake. I'll get rid of the sin and the dark and the sadness you let in here. I'm coming back for you." And he would. One day, God himself would come. So, in thinking of our fruit of the week, which is self-control, I kind of talked about it in the story a little bit. But do you think Eve had self-control in this story? When God asked her and Adam to not eat from the tree, That was his one rule. But then Satan, the snake, came along, and we know that the serpent or the snake didn't like God. The snake came along and asked Eve, well, if you want to eat the fruit, why don't you just eat it? So do you think Eve had self-control there? She ate the fruit, and even though she knew that God didn't want her to. So she did what she wanted to do, not what God wanted her to do. So do you think she had self-control? Think about it. She did what she wanted to do and not what God wanted her to do. I don't think she had self-control there. And sometimes it might be hard for us to have self-control. Sometimes we want to do things that we want to do and not necessarily that God wants us to do. Sometimes we might want to yell at our brother or sister because we're angry. But that's not how God wants us to be with our brother and sister. He wants us to be, like I always say, loving and kind, just like Jesus. So sometimes even though we want to do something, that's not what God wants us to do. And that's what having self-control is doing what we know that God wants us to do. So that's our story for the week. I hope that you all have a great week. Try and stay cool. I know it's hot out there. Maybe some of you have a pool or a sprinkler or something. And if you do have a pool, I'm jealous. I wish I had a pool. But yeah, I hope you all have a really great week. I will be sending the lesson with some activities tomorrow, and I hope you take some time to look at that. And you can rewatch the story as you're doing the activities, whatever you want. Have a great week, everybody. I'll see you next week.